So hello, I'm going to start trying, this is going to be a short video for chapter 1 of the How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going. And these are intended to be just a little bit of a piece of the conversation of each chapter. And I hope that as you watch each one that it gives you a little bit of a taste, maybe answers some of your questions. But I hope that you will also take time with the discussion sheets and thinking it through as well as actually reading the chapter. But I welcome you to do whichever part you have time for and to see how that what thoughts that starts going as you head into it. As we start this book, the first chapter is an introduction to liminality, and I don't know how you will read this book, but I know the word liminality was the piece of getting my head around that word, was the beginning of being able to read this book and not feel like I kept hitting the wall of something that was being discussed that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So I want to start with the definition of liminality. It says that a liminal space is a season when something has ended, but a new thing has not yet begun. I think about all of the places that might, and sometimes the image that they use is the threshold between the ending and the beginning. So it really is that in between time that this is ended or changed, and you don't know yet fully what comes next. So you're in this space in between. And in that definition is understanding that we hit that, and sometimes we go through it really quickly, and sometimes it takes a longer time. You can think about, as we've been in this time of the pandemic, that the push for the new normal was that sense of what we had known had ended, and we were in this space that didn't quite make sense, and we weren't sure what was supposed to come next, but so the new normal was what we wanted so that we could get to that past the liminal time. The liminal time is indeed standing in that middle ground when you don't know what comes next, but you're, a sense, have the opportunity to explore it. When we think scripturally of the stories that talk about this liminal time, one of the key places is the story of the Israelites in the wilderness. And one of the places that shows some of our struggle with that is several times the Israelites complain as they travel through the wilderness, but they finally get to this place where Moses sends spies into the promised land to scope it out, to bring back the news of what it's going to be. And I'm sure that you've had many of those times of those, you're going to go to a place that's unknown to you, and the stories that come back, and trying to figure out whether it's going to be a fun time or a not fun time, or what are going to be the things you're looking forward to, particularly if it is a challenge to you to step outside of where you're comfortable. So Moses sends the spies out, and the story is that when they come back, there's those that give a positive report of, wow, this place is fabulous and really, really great, and you are gonna love it. And then there's another minority report, as they might call it, of those that come back saying, you're not gonna like anything about this place. They're just super giants, and there isn't anything there to like, and they're gonna just step all over us, and it's just gonna be horrible. You don't want to go there for any reason whatsoever. And as the story goes, it's those negative voices that keep spreading all around that prevent the Israelites from even attempting to cross into the promised land, and ultimately end up staying in the wilderness for another generation because of that report. So as we think about this liminal time, there's good things and bad things about it. I think when I think of that wilderness time, if you look closely, their liminal time in the wilderness shapes them as a people. All of the rules and the laws and how they interact with each other, and the trusting of God through the manna and his presence in the cloud and in the flame and in the temple, and all of the ways that he's present are ways that help them come to understand who they are and who they should be in the world, or who God is calling them to be in the world. And it's the thing that ended was their slavery in Egypt, and the thing that is yet to happen is this whole story of the promised land. So I invite you to think about kind of where that might apply in your lives, because it can be that time between graduating high school and going on to college, or graduating college and heading out into the world. It comes naturally into our lives in many places, and sometimes we're really aware of them, and sometimes it's become so naturally a part of our journey that we don't think of it as a time that is a time to prepare for what comes. And some of us just aren't planners and jump in anyway. Now, some of what this book talks about in this liminal space is that there are 3 stages to being in a liminal space. And one is that first separation, that event or change that creates an ending to what came before. And like I said, it's so many things at graduation, turning 13, turning 18, that place where it's time to be an adult, just first, all kinds of things are that ending. And so some of what it talks about is that there are those that are natural to us as individuals. Events that happen can be divorces, they can be marriages, can be what ends that piece before. In the church, there are several pieces that are present in our lives as Christians and church leaders and church participators at this point in time in history. And one of the big ones that's named is this reality that every 500 years, or this understanding that every 500 years, the church goes through this massive change where it essentially reimagines itself, because the older traditions, the things that had become the assumption of what was, are no longer working to reach people. And these have happened in the Great Reformation, they've happened throughout the history, and it's written about as one of these big changes that we are in presently, which is a response to the fact that Christianity in the United States has been in decline for over 50 years. It's part of what's pushing us to re-examine. But there is no one answer yet of what is the church going to look like. What are the things that absolutely work? Some work in different places, and it isn't just a matter of praise band versus the organ, because both can be in certain circumstances, or either one can be the thing that connects and takes the church to that next place. So it's that's Christendom. That is something that I say none of us has real control over at this point in time. But that is a factor that's working for every church as they're trying to figure out what comes next. And is that separation from all the things that used to be, and the way they used to be, and the way they used to work. Now, some of the ones that are named in the book that I'll lift up that I think of as specific also to Maplewood would be the change in pastor. Maplewood has had the same pastor for the last 12 years. Excuse me. That creates a certain sense of knowing what's happening. And changing pastor brings that uncertainty that takes us into this liminal time of what is going to continue, how's this person going to fit, what's this all mean? And so we're in that liminal time as a new pastor following somebody who's been there for 12 years. Some of the other piece that I saw as I was reading this book as we first started kind of the quarantine of the pandemic, was this piece is the pandemic has thrown us into a liminal time. A liminal time in the church, in the sense of all the ways we used to do church, small groups, gathering for big potlucks, big funeral dinners, which was one of those things that people are looking forward to the most and miss not being able to have because it's part of how we say goodbye. And so within the church, the ending of everything we knew, maybe a temporary ending, maybe a full ending, but we're living in this time of we're just trying to keep our heads above water and figure out what to do, but there's no clear answer of when it's ending. There's no clear answer of what comes next for the church as the impact from this. And I also think very truthfully that it's done the same thing so much for us as individuals, whether it was big family gatherings or grandparents taking care of kids, whether it's jobs, whether it's football games, all of the things that used to define our days and our weeks just got turned upside down. So to me, that's some of the sense of how do we listen to the sense that we are in a liminal time, and what does that mean, and how does that help us cope with the fact that we can't force our way out of this liminal space. So in the sense of the stages, that's the separation has happened, and in some ways we're not in control of that. In many ways we're not in control of it. It's a product of all of the things that come into play. In the second stage of the liminal, being in a liminal state, is indeed that liminal time, living in that space in the in-between, standing on the threshold of the something's ended and yet what's going to be hasn't started yet. Now, as human beings, our tendency is very much to either want to run back to what we knew or to jump forward to what's going to be. And you see both of those struggles, the going back and the holding on to what we know because there's comfort and understanding in that, and jumping ahead. There's a feeling of accomplishment. Okay, so the goal was to get back to a place where we feel good, so we want to jump forward. Our struggle as an organization is that our goal should be, what we need to do in this liminal time is really start to be able to shape. But it's part of it is remembering that there's not, here's the program you need to start, here's how you need to set up the seats in the sanctuary, here's what kind of music you need to play, these are the songs to sing, this is what success looks like. That picture doesn't exist yet. So as a group, or even as an individual, living in that liminal time is about trying things. It's about experimenting. It's about taking a deep breath and saying, even though I don't know all of the answers, I'm okay. And we have a great advantage of that in our faith, is because even if we don't know all of the answers, we can trust in God's presence and love for us in a way to give us that strong foundation as we wander around in this liminal time. One of the things that the book says is that a liminal organization needs to unlearn old behaviors, challenge the status quo, experiment, take risks, and learn. Those in themselves, that quote in itself causes us to want to run back to what we know. Taking risks is scary, and there's a lot of pieces to that. But it is a chance within this time of being in this liminal period of figuring out who we are. What are the things we love so much we want them to continue? What are the things that are going to define us into the future as we find our way? And figuring out what works. Being in this time, there are challenges. As the book talks about, the challenges of coming together. It's no longer a situation of everybody who used to have say, it just continuing what they want. It is that challenge of what do we want? And how do we hear from all of the voices in our congregation, but also in our community and around us, to understand what would help us best help someone else come closer to God. And that's a real challenge because we are particularly living in a time where the only people I listen to are the ones that say what I want to hear. That's where I'm comfortable. And I'm not saying that's where so much of our society is. So the challenge is, how do we listen to views that don't hold ours? Whether it's about music, whether it's about style of worship, whether it's about how we do Bible studies, whether it is about the color of the rug. I try to set those up as ones we know some of the sense of conflict and some of the sense of how do we find our way. We are also in this place as the denomination is making decisions that we're part of what's the direction for the denomination. All of those things impact. And some of the challenge with being in that time and listening to each other is there's not a whole lot as far as we've just increased our numbers by 50 people in worship when you're in the stage of trying to figure out who you are. It's small steps. It's a process of, in sometimes, a little bit of standing still for a moment in that space until you fully understand who you are and discern together who you're going to be. The other part in that sense of experiments is that we were going to do one of those experiments. We were going to try doing an event with the pool and inviting everybody from the neighborhood. We didn't know whether there was any whether the neighborhood was looking for such an event, whether we would have 10 people show up or 50 people show up. But we were going to try because one of the things we know we need to do is to hear from our neighbors, to begin to build those relationships that will help us find our place in the neighborhood in a changed culture where we are. So that's one of the challenges of doing those experiments, daring to step out and not beating yourself up if the outcome isn't a whopping success. The other is this push and pull. Those that want to go back and those that want to get done with the figuring it out and get forward, those pieces make this a hard place to be because you can't say, I know the answer, and if we do A, B, C, and D, everything's going to be perfect and everybody will love it. It just doesn't happen. So that's one of the challenges of being in this time, is that it looks really different than when you're saying, okay, these are the steps I need to take that will result in the outcome that I'm after. We don't really know how to get to the outcome that we're after. In some ways, we don't even know what the outcome is going to look like. It's been the challenge like of VBS, as it becomes harder and harder to gather large groups of children because of the number of activities. The challenge becomes to say you still want to impact kids' lives, so what does that look like? What are the ways in which you can still impact as many kids or more? What works in that place? Now, one of the other challenges that the book names in this chat of being in this liminal time is tricksters, that there are people who thrive on the chaos and just take the opportunity to cause more chaos, and that you have to be careful that we don't get distracted and go off track by somebody who just wants to cause chaos and trouble and destruction. And sometimes I'll tell you truthfully, you never know who that person is until the dust clears and you're down the road. The only things you can look for are those that are truly trying to build rather than tear down. And because the truth is, in that experiment time, we'll all have different ideas of what is the right experiment to try at any given moment. But the book also is really challenging us to understand the blessings of this liminal time. Some of what we talked about and we'll talk about later in the book is the life cycle of any organization, and that it's the shape of a bell curve, and at one point you're always growing and the next you're declining until you redefine yourself. So one of the blessings of the liminal time is about that redefining, reclaiming the things that have made Maplewood everything everybody loves about it, and renaming, reshaping, and defining them again for a new life, plus taking on whatever those new pieces are that help continue that story in a positive way. One of the things that has been true for Maplewood are these strong connections, the relationships that have been built that have sustained people. One of the strengths of the liminal time is that we come back to those relationships. We come back to the table and start with the listening to each other. What are the things you're thinking? What are the ways in which we continue and grow and define ourselves? And not just growth in numbers, but growth in the strength of our relationship with God. And it is about this liminal time. The blessing is that we are finding our way to the promised land. Not in the sense like the wilderness, they weren't lost. They were uncertain and unsure of what would take them into the promised land and have it be everything they wanted it to be. So here's our chance in this time to figure out what are the things that will help us enter the promised land and the new life at Maplewood that allows it to be everything that we have dreamed of and imagined. Now, the next stage after that liminal time in these three stages is reorientation. Is that, okay, we've learned, we've tested, we've tried, we've figured out, we've claimed, we've retold the stories of who we are and reimagined how that helps us in the culture in which we live now. And we begin to set up those new pieces, that new pattern forward, which it falls into the new normal piece, but I don't like that term at all. But it starts to set in place the pieces that help us feel like we know what comes next. And we know how to live into it, and we know where our part is in it. All of those pieces are what comes after kind of that liminal period. So I invite you to think about what are the liminal things that are happening in your life. What are the things that have ended that you don't know what comes next, or you're still in the process of forming and living into what comes next. And also thinking about what are the emotions that brings up for you. Thinking about then how do we all start to begin to be at least a little okay to live in this liminal time and find our way through it together. And that is really, that's the piece for me that trying to figure out is this piece of how do we begin this process of listening to each other, learning from each other, and dreaming about what comes next. The good news we do know is that the Israelites do eventually go into the promised land. And as the story goes in the very general sense is everything comes true that they imagined. Now, at the same time, in the more detailed sense of reading that is the sense of reality of life. It's not all smooth sailing. But the challenge is about going through it together and listening. So I hope that this helped you think about or understand that piece of what a liminal time is. It's a fun word once you get used to it. And I pray that you will be part of this conversation as leaders thinking about dreaming and experimenting as we move forward. Will you pray with me? Holy God, in each step of our journey, there's something new, a new challenge, a new question, but also, O God, a new blessing. Help us to travel this journey together. In Jesus' name, amen.